I'm Kingsley Hugh Smith from BlackHistoryPeople.com. Who was Ida B. Wells, and how much do you know about her story? Stay tuned.
There weren't a lot of templates for what I wanted to do. I didn't grow up seeing any ideas or any examples of Black women investigative reporters.
Nicole Hannah-Jones is a correspondent focusing on racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine.
Well, there's probably no one who did more to illuminate the shame and disgrace of lynching in America during that period than Ida B. Wells.
Brian Stevenson directs the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama.
We're talking today with the executive producer of Humankind, David Freudberg, and Humankind can be located and found on the web at humanmedia.org. Now, David, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, Kingsley, because you're a long-time dear friend, I'm delighted to be with you again.
And we certainly appreciate the fact that you're taking some time today to talk to us about Ida B. Wells. First, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Human Media. You use the tagline, Voices of Hope and Humanity. So tell us a little bit about your mission at humanmedia.org.
So the Humankind public radio program began production in 1997, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, at that time the principal federal source of funding for such programs, decided that they would smile on the idea of this project. And in essence, I describe it as people trying to hold on to their humanity. How do we do that in these very challenging times when there are threats, when people are being drawn into coarse language, coarse conduct, when we're being divided from each other rather than united? What can we do to hold on to our humanity so that we don't succumb to the forces that are trying to dehumanize us? And that's a long project, many, many facets of it. And I love to record interviews with people about that, to hear their stories, to be inspired by ways that they're holding on to their humanity. And some of those stories involve not present-day events, but historical events. And that is what got us to the story of Ida B. Wells, who I knew nothing about until a couple of years ago. And then the more I learned about this lady who was born in 1862, the more I realized what a remarkable life story she has. And I'm going to endeavor to reconstruct some of that in this audio documentary. So that's how the project came about.
So I suppose we'll start with who Ida B. Wells was, a reporter, journalist, and crusader for African American civil rights and equal rights for women. One thing I was impressed about by listening to her story, you talk to Paula Giddings, her biographer.
At first, she had trouble getting people to believe her. It was such an outrageous that this lynching was going on with impunity.
And David Blythe, a Yale University historian, and I think they add some really good perspective to her story.
Well, they do. They've studied this in much greater depth than I ever have, and really have mastered the subject. And how fascinating it is to chat with these historians and try to understand things from their perspective of having spent literally years going back to the documents. David Blythe, the Yale historian, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for his wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass, and Paula Giddings really wrote the definitive biography of Ida B. Wells. They were able to give me some context on the times in which this arose, and really just how outrageous it was that in the lifetime of Ida B. Wells, she was born on a plantation during slavery time in 1862, before the Civil War ended. And there was, not long after that, a surge of lynchings happening in the United States. In the end, thousands of victims of this domestic terrorism were identified. and there was very little law enforcement going on. They basically could just outright murder these people with impunity. Law enforcement would look the other way. In some cases, law enforcement was participating in these acts of barbarism. And Ida B. Wells, who was a strong-willed person, apparently short of stature, but giant in her contribution to American history, had decided that she was going to document what was going on. People were looking the other way. People knew about it, but they didn't know the details of it. And she very boldly went into some of these scenes where African Americans, formerly enslaved people, had been strung up, and went in and started asking questions. And she took her life in her hands when she did so. Ultimately, her own life was threatened with lynching itself. And she decided that she was eventually going to move north. She was born in Mississippi. She was in Memphis for a time. She became publisher of a newspaper there. She wrote many freelance articles for other publications. And when they threatened to kill her, she just decided she needed to come north. And she ultimately settled in Chicago, but was many years in New York City, where there were some distinguished African American newspapers at the time.
So she was a school teacher before she got into the realm of writing those newspaper articles. And she wrote, as you've said, specifically about discrimination. And she observed this discrimination during the late 19th and early 20th century. So let's talk a little bit more about how she examined the violent history of white supremacy that you've already referenced. I think you mentioned in the documentary that she actually dove right into police records and newspaper records so she could document the history of lynching.
Right. Now, it was explained to me among the historians that we spoke with that the use of statistics of any kind was kind of a rare thing. That developed more as the 20th century evolved. There were precious few records. There were some court records, there were some police records that she culled through to the extent that she could access them. Of course, in the pre-internet days, all of that was very, very hard to do. But there were a number of newspapers who were already onto the story in a way that delved in depth. And she was able to learn a lot from articles that had been published, and she combined and collated those materials together to write some of her articles. And there were eyewitnesses to some of these crimes that she interviewed, and they were able to document the story. And this was very bold. The idea of investigative journalism as we think of it today, it's kind of hit a renaissance period in the era of the Donald Trump presidency because there are so many scandals to be investigated. It wasn't happening at that level in those days. It was quite rare for journalists to be able to really investigate so carefully. And she was also an editorialist. She was not purely a neutral, objective journalist, but she used her publications as kind of a soapbox to say, look, we've got to come to terms with this. It's a horrific thing happening in the United States, and we have to acknowledge it and work to combat it. So she used that megaphone that was given to her through her publications to shed light on this problem. She was an editorialist, but from my point of view, it was no less valid. She was just saying, look, let's view this for what it is and try to find a way to combat it. And she had great moral fervor in her message, and frankly, it's pretty hard to dispute what she said.
We're talking with David Freudberg. David is the executive producer of Humankind, and as a special, he has prepared Ida B. Wells' Battle to Uncover the Truth, which is a documentary that you can hear, and we hope you listen to it. We'll tell you about that in a bit. David, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that she was literally run out of town during her pursuit of telling the truth. It's just another aspect of her story, and I think you mentioned that she had a gun, and she made the decision, well, she could use the gun when she was getting harassed at a specific point in her journey, but then she decided, well, it's better just to leave town and continue doing some of the battle that she was doing. I wanted to move forward to her years with the NAACP when she co-founded with W.E.B. Du Bois and others in 1909. Now, you bring up a really interesting story about Fraser Baker, and perhaps you can tell us who Fraser Baker was and how Ida B. Wells got involved in his story.
Back in the late 1800s, one of the presidents of the United States was named William McKinley. During the period of his administration, there was something of a greater receptivity to hiring African Americans, many of whom had formerly been enslaved and now were emancipated and were looking for work. In that time period, the post offices were among the federal jobs that African Americans could obtain. There was a gentleman in South Carolina by the name of Fraser Baker. He was the first African American postmaster of the town of Lake City, South Carolina. And some of the white patrons of the post office were not too thrilled to have this man serving as their postmaster, and they were rude to him, and they ultimately became quite nasty and quite violent, and they murdered the postmaster along with his infant daughter, and this was committed by white terrorists. And Ida B. Wells was appalled by this behavior and by this criminal activity, and she led a delegation of members of Congress and pastors to Washington, D.C., and they met in the White House with President McKinley to demand that he do something about this. And that was some of her boldness. And there was only so much that McKinley could do. It took until the year 2018, until the Congress of the United States passed an anti-lynching law.
Right, and it was the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act, as you mentioned, 2018, approved unanimously, and the bill was co-sponsored by Kamala Harris.
And Cory Booker.
That's right.
Both of whom were candidates for president in the Democratic primary in 2020. And these were powerful stories being told about this. Imagine all those years, more than a century later, the Congress of the United States had not acted on this. How much work we still have to do.
You have that right. David Freudberg, he is the executive producer of Humankind, and this special, it's called Ida B. Wells, Battle to Uncover the Truth. You can listen to the program by going to humanmedia.org. You can go to the top of the page. There's a search bar there. Just type in Ida B. Wells or Wells. I've tried them both, and you'll get right to the page. David, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today about the life and the legacy of Ida B. Wells Barnett.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Kingsley.
David Freudberg is the executive producer of the public radio program Humankind. You can hear Ida B. Wells' Battle to Uncover the Truth at humanmedia.org. Just search for Ida B. Wells. I'm Hugh Smith for BlackHistoryPeople.com.